everyone, and welcome to this third episode of the Questionare English version. Last week, we talked about the vaccines and how this affected the US-Mexico relationships regarding migration. We talked also about child migrants going to the border and the crisis that was generating in it. This episode, we're going to cover some topics related to that, specifically the vaccines. The United States has reached its goal of putting 100 million doses in the first 100 years of Biden's administration, which has been seen to the international community as an accomplishment and as a milestone that was achieved by this administration. Also, there has been some agreements between the United States and Mexico's government regarding this. Some vaccines will be lent to Mexico from the United States. And we will also talk about the situation that tragically happened in Atlanta this last week. Dr. Stone, I would like to start with you. What has happened with the vaccines in the United States? How does the Biden administration has reached 100 million doses in less than 100 days of administration?
Sure. So back even before Biden took office on January 20th, he had promised that there would be 100 million doses, as you said, right? Which does not necessarily mean 100 million people fully vaccinated, simply that 100 million doses of the vaccines would have been injected into people's arms, right, by the time his first 100 days in office were concluded. Even at the time, many experts, including, for example, Sanjay Gupta on CNN and so on, had said that they thought that was very achievable. They thought that, the vaccine rollout was ramping up. They knew it would probably ramp up further under a Biden administration. And that's what happened, right? At around day 58 of his administration, the US had already vaccinated or rather had already injected, right, 100 doses of the vaccines into people's arms. Now there's talk, Biden himself, right, said that it's possible that the US might hit 200 million doses in the first 100 days if the vaccine efforts keep ramping up, if the state governments on which this effort still heavily relies continue to do what they need to do. That's possible, right? Now, we're not talking about 100 million people, as we said, right? For example, one person who's received 2 doses, which is what's required of the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, that would count as 2 doses, right? Not as 1. So right now, about 15% of the US population is fully vaccinated, with many, many, many more who have received the first dose of either the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. And then finally, with the approval by the FDA of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires 1 shot, the number of people, not the number of doses, right? The number of individuals who are fully vaccinated is probably going to start going up fairly quickly because, you're one and done, right? You go in, you get the shot, you walk out, you're vaccinated. Yeah. So that's been a huge achievement on the part of this administration. Was some of that put in place in the Trump administration? Sure, right? But the Trump administration, it's clear now, we know clearly now, the Trump administration really had no plan. There was no federal plan to vaccinate. There was no real coordination with the states. And it's true, right, that state governments are doing the bulk of this work, but there was no real cohesive structure from the federal government to ensure that the states were doing what they needed to do to support the states, right, to work with the states. And the Biden administration has made it a priority with the passage of the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, the most recent one. There's a lot of money in there to help states continue this rollout and achieve what they need to achieve to get most Americans vaccinated this year, at least those who want to get it. And finally, right, just as a reminder, President Biden said that by the end of May, the US should have enough doses of the vaccine to vaccinate every American who wants to get vaccinated. And there probably won't be a vaccine mandate. That's not going to happen. But around 70% of the American people say, American adults, right, say that they either are already vaccinated or plan to get vaccinated. That's pretty good. And if you can do that by the summer, right, maybe you can have, as President Biden has said, sort of a normal-ish, right, 4th of July celebration. And that would be a huge achievement for the United States logistically and in terms of sort of just the medical system working, at least when it needs to in situations like this.
Yes, that's completely right, Doctor. And I think it's really relevant to point out the fact that Trump administration began a really slow pace with the vaccination, and they expected to have achieve 30 million doses by December. They didn't even achieve 10 million, I think. I think they just achieved 9 or 8 million. So there were high stakes regarding this first objective of Biden's administration. And I think it was the most important one because in his campaign, he established that the frictions that Dr. Anthony Fauci and Donald Trump had, they were not contributing to the best results of the vaccination campaign that haven't even started yet at that point. And now President Biden achieved the goal that he promised. He kept the promise that he made to these electors during the campaign. And I think it will be a great step for the United States because let's remember that sadly, more than 500,000 people have died in the United States of COVID-19 officially. It is the highest rate mortality in the world, counting every human being, not as a percentage of the total population, but as each individual death. So that's something to consider. But Valeria, I want to ask you, Joe Biden has achieved these 100 million vaccines. What's next for the United States regarding the vaccination? We know that there are 3 vaccines, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. But what about the other vaccines that the United States is not contemplating?
Sorry, I honestly think that the United States is just going to stay with the 3 vaccines that it already has, because it already has the Pfizer and the Johnson & Johnson plants in the US, so they can pressure them directly to produce vaccines. And it's easier to get vaccines by applying direct pressure instead of waiting for the other vaccines to be made. So I honestly don't think that they're going to approve another one. They might approve the AstraZeneca one, the really controversial one, which Mexico is getting 2.5 million doses and Canada is getting 1.5 million doses from the US. But as I was researching for this episode, basically the fact that they haven't approved this vaccine is due to 2 main reasons. First, there were some inconsistencies in how they analyzed the sample data that they got during the vaccine trials. So basically they mixed data between the one that they obtained in the trial in Brazil and then the one that they obtained in the trial in the UK. So this caused some sampling inconsistencies because they mixed people from different demographics and some people were skeptic of these results. And the US is still running their trial for the AstraZeneca one. So if they have positive results from that one, they might apply it. And it's supposed to start being applied if it's approved, I think at the end of April. But aside from that one, I don't think we're getting the Chinese vaccines in the US or the Russian one.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think in a political scenario it will be possible for the US to negotiate with Vladimir Putin or with Xi Jinping regarding vaccines, especially after President Biden called President Putin an assassin or a killer regarding the interference in the 2016 and 2020 elections. But I want to come up with a follow-up regarding this topic to Dr. Stone. Doctor, do you think at some point vaccine tourism will be a reality in the United States? Because we know they have lots of doses that they are going to produce, but probably there will be no more Americans to get vaccinated at some point in this year. Do you think that vaccine tourism, it will be a thing by this year?
Yeah, I think by the second half of the year, maybe the last quarter of the year, there will probably be a wide availability of the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, at least, right? I think Valeria's on the right track here. I think it's probably AstraZeneca, probably not that many more will get approved in the near future. But yeah, I think there can be wide availability, right, of the vaccine at your local Walmart, Walgreens, or CVS, right? I think you'll be able to get it everywhere. Maybe you'll even be able to get it at Walmart. I don't know. But yes, I think there are going to be vaccines pretty much everywhere in the U.S. by the end of the year. If you're not a U.S. citizen, a resident, permanent resident, maybe you'll have to pay for them. I don't know. At some point, that might be a thing, right? But the U.S. has ordered, I'm not exactly sure on the number, but it's ordered, I believe, over 1 billion vaccine doses, right? So at some point, once the vaccine production ramps up, the U.S. will have many more doses than it needs for the American population. Is it going to keep some in reserve? For sure, right? I think any major country today is going to want to keep a large number of these in reserve. But are they going to start sharing them with the rest of the world? Yeah, right. And are they going to care that much if people come in from abroad, outside of the United States to get the vaccine? Probably not, right? And at the end of the day, tourism is good for economies, wherever that may be, right? And we already have, for example, for Mexico, right? We already have quite a few people who drive up or fly up, right, to McAllen and to all of these border towns, Laredo, to go shopping, right? That we know that's fairly common in amongst a certain sector of the Mexican population. And yeah, right. Let's say you're going to do your Christmas shopping in Laredo or McAllen, and you go into Walgreens and get a COVID-19 vaccine. I mean, there might be, I'm hoping that before the end of the year, Mexico will have access to many, many more doses of the vaccine. I think that will be the case, either because they're coming from the US or because the vaccine manufacturers have been able to increase their production quite a bit by then. I think people who have the means, right, from Latin America, maybe from other places, I think will start going to the US, maybe even from Canada, right? I mean, most of Canada's population, I think it's about 70%, lives within a few miles of the US border. It's not hard, right, for Canadians to cross into the US at Niagara Falls or wherever they want to cross and get a shot. So I think that's very possible. I think once the US is vaccinated, Biden will start working more with COVAX, the World Health Organization program, to try to make sure that vaccines are available. China and Russia are already doing that. They're exercising a lot of soft power right now, right, through sharing their own vaccines. And I think the US, especially the Biden administration, will be very conscious of that and of what they can achieve through this sort of soft power. I'll say politically, right, domestically, Biden is very consciously trying to do a thing that does not usually happen in American politics, which is to win more seats, right, to increase Democratic majorities in the midterm elections. Usually when you have a Democratic president, elected in, for example, 2020, then Democrats will lose seats in Congress in 2022. If it was a Republican president in 2020, then Republicans would lose seats in 2022. We saw that with Trump, right? The first midterm after Trump was elected, 2018, Republicans lost quite a few seats. Biden's team is very consciously trying to turn success with the pandemic and success with the economic fallout of the pandemic into the rare midterm election where the president's party gains seats in Congress. That might be possible, right? If you can get to the 4th of July with people, with 2/3 of the country or more already fully vaccinated, and you can get to the 4th of July with people having received all of their checks, right, including the $1,400 that are going out right now from the COVID bill, and seeing the new child tax credits, right, coming into their bank accounts every month. Those things are huge, right? They're going to make a big difference in the lives of many, many, many Americans. And putting all that together, that could potentially lead to Democrats doing well in the 2022 midterms. It's still a little ways away, right? But people, I think, even though we have short memories in politics, I think people will remember this because this is the biggest, for many of us, right? This is the biggest event to occur in our lifetimes, right? This COVID pandemic. And I think a lot of voters will be willing to consider that as a very important part of who they vote for in November 2022.
Yes, I agree, Doctor. I think that not only for the United States, but I think also for every major government in the world, the top credential will be how many people have you vaccinated. Electorally speaking, that will be the changing point or the turning point that decides whether someone's being reelected or wins or loses seats. Regarding the thing that Dr. Stone said, Valeria, regarding this Mexico-United States agreements or some type of deal that has happened. We know that AstraZeneca's vaccine has not been approved by the FDA, but it has been approved by Mexican authority COFEPRIS. And currently in Mexico, we are applying those AstraZeneca vaccines as of this moment. The United States has made this agreement. Chancellor Marcelo Ebrard and Secretary Antony Blinken have reached an agreement in which there will be an immigration order involved in the length of those vaccines How is this working, Valeria? Because we know that there's a crisis, there's a migration crisis in the United States, in the southern border. There are lots of kids going there. We talked about it last week, but it's currently going on, and there's not an actual solution, or yes, like there's no actual solution to the problem. So what could this strategy or deal between the United States and Mexico governments affect?
I think like it's my own personal opinion, my analysis of the situation. It's basically I'll give you vaccines as long as you keep people from coming into the border. Because there was a report by the New York Times this week where they said that authorities from Biden's government had been pressuring authorities from Mexico's government to control migration, to do more. So basically, I think it's I give you this and you give me that, because despite the US idea that they are the savior of the world, they always do something to get something in return, like any government does. AMLO speeding up his vaccination campaign in the municipalities that are more rural, because those are the municipalities that tend to vote for him. He will get to the cities, but he will do so after, even though it would have made sense to start the other way because it's where more people are congregated. So I think it's basically the same, where they will give us the vaccines and they will continue to do so because, like Dr. Stone said, we live in a globalized world and it's impossible to act like people not being vaccinated in Mexico is not going to affect the US, because it is going to affect the US. So I think that it has a lot to do with that position, and they will give them, but they will always ask for something in return from Mexico. And right now, despite AMLO's claims of sovereignty and whatever he will say to justify this, I think they will keep pressuring on the topic of migration.
Yes, because let's remember that Secretary Saki 3 weeks ago, when they had this bilateral meeting, online meeting, President Biden and President Lopez Obrador said that the United States would not share any vaccines as of the moment. And 3 weeks after, we are seeing that the United States is going to lend. So let's be clear with the word lend. They're not giving away. They're not. Yes, we're going to have to pay these vaccines at some point. We don't know when, but we're going to pay them. And this strategy of the United States, like utilizing the vaccine as a soft power strategy, is not going to be the last time it happens. I think there's going to be several times where the United States is going to use this leverage it has, having lots of vaccine doses available. Because let's remember that lots of Latin American countries are struggling to get their people vaccinated. And despite Chile, who is doing great with the vaccination process, I think every other Latin American country is struggling, and struggling big time regarding the time in which the 2/3 of the population expected to be vaccinated to achieve this immunity, this common immunity should happen. But leaving beside the topic of the vaccines and the U.S.-Mexico relationship regarding this leverage that there has been with this agreement, there has happened a major event in Atlanta, Georgia, a tragedy really. There has this guy came into a mall and starting to shoot people, specifically Asian American people, through a speech that was referring that the Asian or the Chinese were the virus. Like they were the holders of the coronavirus and they were the cause of the coronavirus. This is obviously not true because the virus does not recognize race, religion, or any other characteristic. But President Trump fifth this speech referring as coronavirus to as the Chinese virus. And this has created a lot of anti-Asian feelings in the United States. So, Dr. Stone, basically, what has happened in Atlanta and how does this affect or compare to the Black Lives Matter situation that we had last April and June? And what should we expect from it?
Sure. Well, as you said, right, this guy who's white, right, went around to 3 different locations, in fact, killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian, right, mostly East Asian women. And part of it certainly is related to their ideas about where the virus comes from. But then later, right after he was arrested, he said that he'd done it because he had a addiction to sex, and that he was doing it to eliminate the temptation that these women posed him, right? Of course, it's become very controversial because the sheriff who was investigating the case at one point said that this guy was simply having a bad day, and that's why he did it, right? And that's, of course, getting a lot of attention, not only from the media and the public, but also from the federal government, right? We now have an administration in the Biden administration that really does care about these things, that is strengthening the human rights division at the Department of Justice, that is actually the civil rights division, sorry, the Department of Justice, right? That is actually working to try to combat racism and discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and national origin, and other types of discrimination, right, across the board. The thing with discrimination against Asians is it's not new. We tend to talk in the United States about the discrimination against Blacks, right, which rightly so, centuries of slavery and then Jim Crow in the United States is a problem. We tend to talk about discrimination against Latinos, especially immigrants, but we don't speak as much about discrimination against Asian Americans and actually about Native Americans, who are also deeply, deeply discriminated. Asian Americans, in particular, East Asian Americans, have been often held up by conservatives and by others as sort of this model minority, right? The minority that does things right, for lack of a better phrase, right? They high education levels, their income levels are similar to those of whites, the wealth levels in Asian families similar to those of whites. But that really just kind of masks the very long historical discrimination against Asians. In fact, the US until the 1880s had no immigration laws at all. Anybody could simply go to the United States and eventually become a US citizen and stay, right? But in the 1880s, after the US had been bringing in workers, mostly from China, Asian workers, mostly from China, to build the railroads, right, the great transcontinental railroads, the US passed its first immigration laws, and they were specifically geared towards Asian women, not towards Asian men, because what was happening was the US would bring these men to work on the railroad. They would then eventually bring their families, which we know is common, right, with immigrants. Eventually you bring your families. And the US was trying to discourage that. So what they did is that they said, well, basically, we think that, Asian women are all basically more likely to be prostitutes. And so before you can come to the US and stay as an Asian woman, we're going to basically do an analysis and see if you're a prostitute. And unsurprisingly, most of the women who tried to migrate from East Asia, particularly China, to the US in that period were deemed to be not appropriate for entry into the United States. At one point, the ratio fell. For every 1,000 Asian men, there were only 47 Asian women in the United States, so 4.7%, right? Because of these laws. Later, the US passed other laws against Asian migration, and really there has long been an idea that Asians are somehow different, right? Just like with Blacks, it's easy to visualize someone who looks different. We know, of course, about the detention camps the US had during World War II, right, that were approved by the US Supreme Court as constitutional under Korematsu, right? For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the US interned large numbers of its Japanese American citizens in these types of concentration camps, detention camps during World War II. Today, the court has declared, the Supreme Court has said that that was unconstitutional, but for decades, that action was considered legally in the United States to have been appropriate. And so my point in all of this is that Donald Trump has definitely exacerbated, like he has with many other things, the racism against East Asians, right? Calling it the China virus repeatedly, even recently in a statement he put out, trying to claim, that he was responsible for the vaccinations. He said, the coronavirus, sometimes called the China virus, right? That hasn't helped for sure. But my point is that there are these deep, I think in many cases, unconscious feelings that somehow Asians are different, right, than white Americans, that somehow Asian Americans are not trustworthy, that they're different, that they're the other, that Asian women are somehow sexualized in some weird ways, which seems to have played into this individual's thinking when he went around killing these 6 Asian women. And so this is hopefully going to cause, as you alluded to, Tonio, a deeper discussion in the United States about racism against Asians. And East Asians in particular, but also against other Asians, right? South Asians, people from, right, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, who often face a ton of discrimination as well, and people from the Middle East, right, who are not classified as being, they're often classified as white, right, when really, of course, in many ways, their experience is not that of sort of the average white person or family in the United States. So yeah, I think this is a pivotal moment. And we'll see if it becomes as significant as George Floyd's murder, but it is definitely looking like that. It's looking like we're finally going to have a reckoning in the U.S. about discrimination against Asians in general, and specifically, I think this sort of intersectional space, right, of discrimination against Asian women in particular.
Definitely, this debate is new. There has not been lots of debate regarding this type of racism, but I consider that the true virus that there's in the United States, there's also racism virus, and I think these cases are really showing the structural weakness that addressing the problem has. So, Valeria,
in fact, if I may interrupt just real quick, I'm sorry. Right, just yesterday there was a debate in the UN at the UN General Assembly. The deputy Chinese ambassador to the UN and the US ambassador to the UN had a discussion about racism, where China was basically saying, hey, the US can't lecture anybody on race and on racism and these issues because you have your own deep problems, right? And the US ambassador was saying, well, yes, we do, but at least we're talking about them. We're trying to figure them out, right? We're trying to resolve them. We're trying to make things better. So I think that at some point, and hopefully people will recognize this, not dealing with these deep racial issues in the United States is going to end up being an international liability in the United States' foreign relations. So unless we can really take real steps and we can really show the world, hey, we really are working on this, any sort of credibility that we might have had on issues of civil rights and human rights in general and on race is simply going to disappear. And so it's really crucial for the United States to tackle these issues head on, to talk about it head on. It's very difficult though, right? Most Republicans still, the vast majority, still do not believe that being Black in the United States is harder than being white, whereas most Democrats do believe that, right? The data shows us that being non-white in the United States is much harder than being white in the United States, pretty much on every measure. But when the question is so polarized and when most voters in the Republican Party don't accept that that's true and oftentimes feel that they're being discriminated against as white people, it's going to be a very difficult discussion to have in any way that is not partisan.
yes, that's probably true. The politics inside it, they're probably going to retard this debate to go on. But Valeria, regarding this topic, are there any comments?
Yes, a lot of them. But basically, I think it's very, very funny how people are trying to justify it, just like Dr. Stone said, like the cops were like, oh, it's because he had like sexual urges and stuff. No, it's not. He was racist. That's it. There's no more discussion to it. It's racism. And I think it's not the first time that this racist act against Asians or Asian Americans has happened in the US. Like before the shooting, there were a lot of incidents during this year where basically Asian people were attacked on the street and they were accused of bringing coronavirus and being it's racist. Even Donald Trump a week or 2 weeks ago said on his letter that the coronavirus, what some people might have called the China virus. Not some people. He called it the China virus. His supporters called it the China virus. That's racist. It's coronavirus. And it's ironic that China has control the coronavirus more than the US. And it's not a topic of, well, they had it first. No, the US had the same information at the same time that China did. All the countries in the world had the same information because they were discovering at the same time. Yeah, there were some cover-ups in China. I'm not justifying that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's racist to keep on calling it the China virus, to attack Asian people, saying that they are at fault for it. They're not at fault for it. Some people are not some of Asian Americans are not even Chinese and they're accused for this. It's racism, and I think they still need to talk about it in the US, because it's not just racism against Black people or members of the Afro American community. It's not just racism against Latinos. It's not just racism against Asians. It's not just racism against Native Americans. Like, if they don't notice that there's a problem when it's racism against every single minority, then they have a problem. I think yeah, there are no words.
100%. And it's intersectional here too, right? At least in this specific case, we are dealing specifically with the murder of Asian women, right? So there's an added layer. I mean, if this was if this had happened in Mexico, they would almost assuredly be considered feminicidios, right? Mexico has this sort of type of crime in its type of murder in its penal code, which says that right, if it's the murder of a woman and the murder is happening because she's a woman, essentially, it's more complicated than that, right? That it will be considered sort of a worse crime than just a murder, right? And the U.S. doesn't really have that, right? For gender, we do have hate crimes, right? In particular with racial groups and so on, but not for gender. And so, to me, this is an important point. It's about Asian Americans and Asians in general, right? And the racism that is very present in the United States against them, but also specifically in this case, hopefully we will talk a little bit more intersectionally about Asian women, right? And what women of color in general face in the United States, right? We know that, for example, basically on every metric, the people who are most, it's hardest to be a Black woman in the United States than pretty much anybody else, right? And so it's not just the racial component, and then added to that, right, the fact that when you are a woman of color, Black woman, an Asian woman, a Latina, right, you are dealing with a different level even of discrimination, because you have these two things that come together to lead to that discrimination: your race, ethnicity, national origin, and then also the fact that you identify as a woman. And that I think has been lost. I know this idea of intersectionality is not maybe as commonplace. We don't talk about it as much outside of the academic world, but it's something that I hope becomes part of the mainstream discussion in the US, right? What happens when you are somebody who is of a different ethnic, national origin, racial group, and maybe you identify as a woman, and maybe you're LGBTQ, right? And so on and so forth. And when you have all of those things come together, your situation is going to be much harder than the situation of somebody who is, quote unquote, only Black, or right, only a woman, and does not have these other factors coming in together. I think this is happening. I think this has been happening slowly over the last 5 years, right? Black Lives Matter movement started some years ago. George Floyd's murder obviously sped that up. I think events like this that are really getting the public's attention are also spurring these conversations. And I'm hopeful that, as tragic as these events are, they're going to help us in the United States to have a better conversation and have a better discussion about, and hopefully find some solutions, right, to what is a deep-seated, long historical discrimination against pretty much every group that is not white.
Yeah, basically, is the structural problem that we have talked about is not something easy to solve. It requires a lot of structural change to be able to solve it. But I think there are high expectancies of this administration, not only because Vice President Kamala Harris has a background that has suffered racism, institutional racism, and the people who are suffering this institutional racism are expecting that she might be the change. Right? She might be the start for changing these structures. So I think we're running out of time. So thank you, Dr. Stone. Thank you, Valeria, for being here. This was English Questionare. Remember to watch us every Monday on the Build Lab. Thank you so much.